Beneath the quiet fields of medieval Europe, far from the eyes of lords and kings, peasants carved into the earth by hand, in silence, with no tools. These weren't tombs or hiding places. They were lifelines. Underground granaries, dug, with bare hands and broken stones, kept families alive through famine, war, and harsh winters. But how did they build these secret chambers? And why did they trust the soil more than the sky? This is the untold story of survival, ingenuity, and the hidden world peasants built beneath their feet in the medieval countryside. Hunger followed a pattern as precise and cruel as a clock. The year began with hope seeds planted in spring, labor stretching into summer, and the harvest finally arriving in autumn. But that window of abundance was brief. What came next was a slow descent into uncertainty. By late winter, the larders of most peasant households were emptying fast. Grain sacks thinned, dried vegetables ran out, and meat, if any had been preserved, was long gone. This stretch of time, often between March and May, was known across Europe as the Hungry Gap, a period when the previous year's harvest was nearly exhausted, but the new crops had yet to grow. In regions like northern France, England, or parts of the Holy Roman Empire, entire villages learned to expect hunger not as a misfortune, but as a season. Storage wasn't just helpful, it was a matter of survival. But for the rural poor serfs, tenant farmers, and landless laborers, building large granaries or sealed pantries was nearly impossible. Timber was scarce or controlled by local lords. Stone was expensive, and any surplus that could be hidden might be seized by tax collectors, passed off as unpaid rent or tithes. In many cases, food itself was taxed at harvest, leaving families scrambling to stretch the little they had left. The countryside was often unstable. A single storm could wipe out crops. Locusts, blight, or mold could destroy stored grains. And worse, famine was frequently accompanied by war. From the 100 Years' War in France to the countless feudal skirmishes between rival barons, armies routinely pillaged villages, confiscating food as they marched. When Edward III launched his Chevauqué into northern France, reports describe soldiers burning fields and taking whatever livestock and stores they found, leaving entire populations to starve through the winter. Church tithes demanded 1/10 of one's harvest. Lords imposed rents in the form of grain or produce. Monarchs levied extraordinary taxes during campaigns or crusades. All of it compounded the insecurity faced by those who produced the very food on which kingdoms depended. In this world, the poorest peasants had only one choice: to outwit the system that drained them. And they did so with quiet, deliberate creativity. They studied the earth. They watched how cold air settled into crevices, how dry clay kept mold at bay, how shadows hid entrances. Without tools, without formal plans, they began to dig. They carved chambers into hillsides, into soft chalk cliffs, even beneath homes and barns. These weren't just storage pits, they were acts of resistance. They allowed families to squirrel away just enough food to last through the hunger season without detection. These hidden spaces were never recorded in official accounts. They weren't part of castle blueprints or manorial surveys. But they existed, nonetheless, beneath the surface, quite literally. A silent, dirt-covered insurance policy against starvation. Because in medieval Europe, survival wasn't just about farming, it was about remembering, each year, that the clock was always ticking and the next hunger was never far off in the rigid hierarchy of feudal Europe. Land was power and peasants owned neither. Every furrow they dug, every sack of grain they reaped, belonged to someone above them. Lords controlled the fields. The church controlled the seasons. And yet, beneath this structure of control, peasants found space literal and symbolic underground. Lacking metal tools, the methods available to them were rudimentary. Iron was reserved for the blacksmith, for the plowshare, or for weapons of war, not for those scraping out secret cellars in the earth. Instead, they turned to what was at hand. Wooden spades carved from oak or ash, sharpened stakes, the shoulder blades of animals left from butchering, or smooth river stones used like primitive chisels. In some regions, horse jawbones with teeth intact were repurposed to scoop and drag soil. And when even that was too risky to carry, they used their hands, fingernails blackened, knuckles torn, wrists raw from scraping. Digging wasn't just physically punishing, it had to be invisible. These makeshift cellars were dug during breaks in field labor, while herding animals, or under cover of night, in areas like the Limousin region of France or the Chocklands of southern England. Peasant families worked in silence, flattening the ground afterward to hide signs of disturbance. Soil was often hauled away in small sacks or baskets, dispersed across the forest floor or scattered in streams to avoid suspicion. In heavily taxed regions of Eastern Europe, some even dug inside their own homes, removing floorboards and scooping downward in the cramped darkness. The terrain dictated the method. In clay-heavy soils, progress was slow but stable. The walls held their shape. In loam or sand, they had to shore up passages with sticks, woven wattle panels, or carefully packed sod. In chalk, the digging was easier but risked collapse if not done in short, reinforced chambers. Without the benefit of engineered knowledge, they relied on observation. If walls wept with moisture, they added ventilation. If rodents were drawn in, they adjusted the depth. If the chamber grew musty, they spread ashes or dried herbs to neutralize the air. One misstep could expose them: a neighbor's betrayal, a suspicious steward, a land survey. In some cases, records show lords ordering punishment for unauthorized storage pits discovered on manor grounds. The term wasn't always used, but the implication was clear. Storing food without the lord's knowledge was an act of concealment, perhaps even theft. In response, peasants adapted. Entrances were camouflaged beneath haystacks, within animal enclosures, or disguised as latrine pits. In border regions prone to war, such as Flanders during the 14th century, entire villages coordinated efforts to build shared underground granaries near forest edges or riverbanks. These communal pits were covered with turf and marked only by memory. What they lacked in technology, they replaced with persistence and shared memory. The work was brutal. Backs bent in cramped tunnels, dirt under the skin. Weeks spent on a single chamber that might only last one winter. But it was done in silence. Not out of shame, but out of necessity. Because in a world where the land was spoken for, and the harvest was already claimed, the only space left to survive in was beneath it. And so, they dug. Centuries before thermometers or refrigeration, peasants across medieval Europe were already using one of the most effective storage systems ever devised: the earth itself. Beneath the surface, just a few feet down, the temperature stabilized. Unlike the chaotic swings of the seasons above, the soil offered consistency: cool in summer, mild in winter, and dark year-round. That constant environment made underground storage ideal for preserving food through the volatile months when famine loomed in chalky regions of southern England. Peasants carved bell-shaped pits narrow at the top, wider below. This shape wasn't accidental. It discouraged rodents, trapped cold air, and kept grain dry. The narrow entrance could be sealed with a clay plug or a layer of ash, further deterring insects and moisture. These so-called silo pits, found across Norfolk and Kent, held enough barley, rye, or oats to feed a small household through the harsher stretch of winter. In northern France. Similar pits have been uncovered beneath former peasant dwellings. Archaeological layers often reveal traces of carbonized grain, evidence that some of these storage chambers succumbed to fire, likely during raids or forced clearances. But the presence of burnt remains also confirms that grain was stored there. In bulk, the pits were functional, and when they failed, the cost was immediate and devastating. Eastern Europe saw a variation of this technique. In the forest steppe zones of present-day Ukraine and Poland, villagers dug long, horizontal storage chambers into riverbanks or loess hills. These chambers, often reinforced with wattle or timber, maintained low humidity and shielded stores. From snowmelt and ground seepage, they were also easier to access in freezing temperatures. Entry points didn't need to be dug out after heavy snowfalls. In contrast, above-ground granaries, large estates, and wealthier freeholders relied on timber frame structures raised off the ground. These required nails, sawn wood, and space, making them expensive and conspicuous. Their advantage lay in ease of access and airflow, but they were vulnerable to fire, to raids, to theft. During conflicts like the 100 Years' War, raiding parties routinely targeted granaries first. Burning them wasn't just a military tactic, it was a warning. Peasants, lacking the means to build high or wide, chose to go down. They didn't have a scientific explanation for thermal inertia or vapor pressure. But over generations, they noticed what worked. Cold soil slowed sprouting in stored tubers. Darkness repelled insects. Ashes spread at the base of a pit, absorbed moisture and masked the scent of stored grain. Dried nettles or tansy plants, known to repel pests, were sometimes packed into layers between sacks. Knowledge passed not in books, but in routines. A child watching where their mother poured ash. A grandfather cautioning about soft soil near the stream. Patterns became survival strategies. Oral tradition formed a kind of localized science tailored to soil types, rainfall, and seasons. There was no blueprint. Each chamber was different, but they all served one purpose: to hold back time, to take a harvest that might spoil in weeks and stretch it across seasons. In doing so, these underground chambers became more than storage. They were memory, trial, and necessity carved into the ground. In medieval Europe, land was not just property, it was hierarchy. Every square foot of earth fell under someone's control: a lord, an abbot, a bishop, or a monarch. For peasants who toiled on this land without owning it, even the act of digging into the ground came with risk. Under the manorial system, tenants were allowed to farm, graze animals, and occasionally gather firewood, but the soil itself was not theirs. Carving a hole into it without permission could be classified as damage to estate property, and what went into that whole grain roots, dried meats, could be interpreted as hoarding, theft, or tax evasion. In parts of England, manorial rolls from the 13th and 14th centuries include fines levied against villains for concealment of produce or withholding tithe grain. Though the terminology varied, the implication was clear: storing food without declaring it to the Lord or reeve was considered subversive. On large estates in Normandy and Flanders, Stewards were known to inspect peasant homes during harvest seasons. Any unreported grain or unauthorized pits could trigger punishment, fines, confiscation, or forced labor. But secrecy bred innovation. In forested areas of the Baltic and Carpathian frontiers, peasants dug chambers along game trails or inside thickets, hidden beneath thick moss and brush. In German-speaking territories, the word Erdkellercellar became part of the vernacular, often describing subterranean caches used by households on the edge of lordly oversight. Closer to settlements, storage pits were concealed more carefully beneath barns, inside pigsties, or directly under the hearthstones of one-room homes. Families hollowed out cavities where they could stash their winter stores. The scent of livestock masked the presence of food. Smoked meat was wrapped in cloths soaked in vinegar or ash to suppress the smell further. In Poland and Lithuania, communities living near the edge of royal forests sometimes used the natural contours of the land to mask their digging. During the reign of Casimir III in the 14th century, reforms attempted to centralize taxation and reduce local corruption. But in practice, tax collectors often pressed harder on those least able to pay. For villagers, creating unauthorized storage underground was a way to reduce exposure, a form of passive defiance. The consequences could be severe. Chronicles from the estates of Cluny Abbey describe several cases where serfs were publicly punished for retaining grain without tithe. In one 1292 entry, a man in Sonnet law was stripped of half his crop and temporarily barred from using communal tools for digging, irrigation, ditches, a subtle yet crippling form of punishment. Despite this, the practice never fully disappeared. Too many depended on it. After poor harvests, when prices spiked and traders hoarded for profit, it was the underground chambers that made survival possible. No formal records acknowledge them, but their presence is confirmed by what archaeologists continue to uncover. Narrow shafts filled with carbonized wheat, sealed clay-lined pits beneath collapsed structures, and stratified layers of storage soil hidden under centuries of rebuild. These were not mere holes in the ground. They were resistance in physical form, shaped by need, hidden by fear, and protected by silence. Storing food underground was not without danger. The same soil that protected peasants from the cold and from watchful lords also carried its own silent threats. A single flaw to much moisture, poor airflow, or an infestation could destroy everything. One miscalculation, and a family's entire winter supply could rot in the dark, unnoticed until it was too late. Ventilation was the first challenge. Without fresh air, underground chambers grew stale quickly. Oxygen depletion wasn't just theoretical, it was real and potentially fatal. In some areas of Eastern Europe, peasants learned to burn incense or straw at the pit's entrance. If the flame burned unevenly or extinguished quickly, the chamber was deemed unsafe. In chalk regions of southern England and the Loire Valley in France, some pits were built with narrow vertical shafts carved beside the main chamber. These acted as crude chimneys, allowing warm air to escape and cool air to circulate. Still, airflow didn't solve everything. Moisture was an ever-present enemy. Soil absorbed humidity from the air above, and seasonal rains seeped downward, threatening to spoil grains or cause vegetables to sprout prematurely. To fight this, ash from hearth fires were spread in thin layers at the base of storage pits. Ash absorbed excess moisture and created an environment inhospitable to mold and insects. In parts of Scandinavia and the Baltic region, dried herbs like tansy, wormwood, or mint were packed between sacks or layered on shelves. These weren't chosen for scent, they acted as natural deterrents against weevils, beetles, and mice. Rodents posed another constant threat. A rat could burrow into a pit, eat its fill, and leave waste behind that contaminated entire stores. In Ireland and Wales, pits were often lined with stone or woven wattle frames where possible, discouraging burrowing. Entrances were sealed not only with earth, but with tight-packed clay or dung mixed with straw, substance hard for rodents to chew through. In harsher winters, when natural food sources dwindled, rats became bolder. Entire caches were sometimes lost overnight. Fire, too, was a risk, though less common. It was more devastating. If stored grains dried too rapidly, methane could build up in confined spaces, creating a flashpoint. Sparks from a torch, or even friction from wool clothing, could ignite a slow-burning fire underground. Charred remains uncovered by archaeologists in regions like Picardy and Moravia show layers of blackened grain fused with collapsed pit walls. These weren't rare accidents, they were reminders of how unstable primitive storage could be without constant vigilance. The stakes were always high. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, onions were packed in layers of straw or sand to reduce rot. Cured meat was wrapped in cloths soaked in vinegar, then buried in shallow pits where the soil remained just cold enough to slow spoilage. Everything had a method, and everything had a risk. Failure wasn't an inconvenience. It meant hunger, illness, possibly death, so the work was never finished. Pits were inspected weekly, sacks turned and repacked. The same care that went into planting seeds in spring had to be repeated again and again, underground after harvest. In darkness, through frost and silence, crises in medieval Europe didn't arrive quietly. They rode in with banners, with fire, with orders scrawled in Latin, and with swords drawn for grain rather than battle. When armies marched, when disease spread, when the taxman came early, it wasn't nobility that starved. It was the peasant who had nothing left to give and everything to lose. During the 100 Years' War, from 1337 to 1453, raids were common in northern France. Soldiers from both sides swept through farmlands not just to fight, but to feed. They looted barns, slaughtered livestock, and demanded grain from every village they passed. In response, peasants across the countryside turned to their secret chambers, buried beneath stables, disguised as animal dens, or hidden under stone hearths. These underground caches were often the last line of defense against enforced starvation. When Edward the Black Prince marched through Limousin in 1356, contemporary accounts described scorched villages and empty storehouses. But what they didn't mention were the pits that went untouched, because no one knew they were there. In some cases, families filled in the entrances and tamped down the earth to erase any trace of their location. A well-hidden cache could mean survival through winter. Discovery could mean confiscation or worse. The Black Death, which arrived in 1347 and ravaged Europe for years, brought a different kind of pressure. Trade collapsed, fields were abandoned, and in the chaos, enforcement of laws broke down temporarily. But even in the midst of plague, local stewards and reeves still arrived, tallying dues and demanding grain that no longer existed. Those who had hidden their food fared better not only against hunger, but against extortion. With the social order destabilized, some peasants refused to pay at all. In the absence of formal enforcement, they sealed up their stores and waited in England. After the Great Revolt of 1381, some lords increased tax scrutiny on villagers believed to harbor rebellious sympathies. Underground storage became a quiet form of defiance. Archaeological evidence from Essex and Kent reveals a spike in pit construction during this time, often deeper, more structurally reinforced, and placed further from the main village. These weren't just for storage, they were insurance against retaliation in times of siege, especially during smaller-scale, feudal skirmishes in the Rhineland or the Italian countryside. Entire villages relied on hidden caches to survive. Some communities developed signals. Children warned of approaching soldiers. Elders led patrols away from key areas. In extreme cases, entrances to chambers were collapsed on purpose, buried under layers of rock or dung to avoid detection. Food was sacrificed to protect the rest. None of this was recorded in charters or estate ledgers. Lords did not acknowledge what they didn't know existed. But the pattern is clear. Every period of instability, whether war, plague, or revolt, with a rise in subterranean storage, it was quiet, invisible resistance. Not against a ruler or a crown, but against a constant threat of being emptied out again. In the fragile economy of the peasant household, a single sack of rye buried beneath the barn might mean the difference between enduring and disappearing. And so, in times of hunger and fear, they turned to the only place no one thought to look. Underground, no manuals, no blueprints, no written record at all. Yet across centuries and across regions, the techniques survived. From the Baltic lowlands to the meadows of Normandy, knowledge of underground storage passed not through parchment but through muscle memory, taught by doing, shaped by necessity. Children didn't learn in classrooms. They learned by crouching beside their elders, watching how earth was lifted, how fingers judged moisture in the clay, how a chamber's ceiling was shaped just wide enough to hold without falling. In rural England, oral traditions preserved practical warnings. Never dig beneath sandy soil. Always face the entrance away from the wind. Use last year's ash first. These weren't folk tales. They were rules for survival. Grandparents passed them on to grandchildren between seasons, between meals, between one famine and the next. In Poland's Masovian villages, a common rite of passage was for young boys to help seal their family's pit before the first frosted task requiring care, timing, and trust. In the highlands of the Czech lands, where bedrock ran close to the surface, peasants learned how to use stone flakes and water to crack through hard layers, creating small vaults just large enough to hold a winter's worth of dried beans or smoked pork. There were no diagrams, no charts, only repetition. A father showing, a son where the frost line began, a mother teaching her daughter which weeds kept insects away. The skills lived in memory, not in ink. These pits weren't just storage, they were repositories of collective knowledge. The way they were dug, the way they were sealed, even the patterns burned into supporting beams all carried meaning. Cultural memory embedded in dirt. Some pits used specific types of clay to prevent rot. Others lined walls with moss gathered only at certain times of year. These weren't superstitions. They were refinements honed over generations. When older generations died, the knowledge sometimes vanished with them. After mass deaths during the Black Death, entire villages were resettled by outsiders unfamiliar with the local terrain. Many of their early storage attempts failed. Grain spoiled, cellars collapsed. Only when techniques were relearned or borrowed from neighboring regions did survival stabilize again today. Much of what's known about these practices comes from what they left behind: tool marks in the soil, collapsed chambers found beneath abandoned farms, pollen samples embedded in ash layers. But in their time, these methods endured not because they were taught in any formal way, but because they were lived, passed from hand to hand, from dirt to mouth, generation to generation. Across Europe, what once lay buried in silence is now being uncovered, sometimes by design, sometimes by chance. In 1998, a farmer ploughing his field near Lincolnshire, England, noticed a collapse beneath his tractor's rear wheel. Beneath the surface, archaeologists later found a bell-shaped pit lined with scorched clay and packed with blackened barley husks. Radiocarbon dating placed it in the 13th century. There were no structures nearby, just the pit, forgotten for over 700 years. It wasn't the first of its kind, and it wouldn't be the last. In recent decades, surveys using ground-penetrating radar and soil magnetometry have revealed hundreds of these chambers beneath former peasant settlements across France, Germany, and Eastern Europe. Some are shallow and orderly. Others are deep, collapsed, or burned, each telling a slightly different story of how rural families responded to crisis and scarcity. At a dig site in southern Poland, researchers uncovered a cluster of 7 underground storage pits dating to the late 1300s. Inside one, they found remnants of charred rye, stored in layered baskets made from woven willow. A few meters away, another pit contained bones, pig and sheep, likely stored meat. A third pit had collapsed inward, and within it were fragments of pottery fused by intense heat. The fire was accidental or deliberate. Either way, it destroyed what may have been months of stored food. These discoveries are rewriting assumptions about medieval survival. For years, historians believed large-scale food storage was a luxury of estates and monasteries. But these finds show that even the poorest peasants, when forced, developed highly localized systems of preservation built without formal plans, but with remarkable consistency. Chemical analysis now reveals how they worked. Traces of ash, plant oils, and preserved herbs show that peasants understood moisture control and pest prevention. Pollen trapped in pit walls indicates which grains were stored. Isotopic sampling even shows how far food may have traveled before being buried, sometimes from neighboring villages, suggesting trade or cooperative hoarding. The remains don't just document food storage, they document resistance. In regions where oversight was strict, such as 14th century Normandy, underground chambers appeared deeper, more carefully hidden. Where taxation was lighter, pits are often nearer to dwellings, more openly maintained. The depth of concealment mirrored the level of control. Each rediscovery adds to a growing picture. These weren't primitive attempts to survive. They were complex, adaptive responses to pressure from the elements, from hunger, and from authority. What the written record omitted, the soil preserved. In the accidental collapses, the layers of char, the traces of forgotten grain, lies a quiet history of struggle only now being unearthed. What modern eyes might dismiss as crude or desperate was, in truth, a feat of engineering, without instruments, refined without books, executed without tools. The underground storage systems built by medieval peasants weren't acts of desperation. They were acts of calculation. Quiet, deliberate, and astonishingly effective. These were not simple holes in the ground. They were temperature-regulated environments, moisture-controlled vaults, pest-resistant containers, all adapted to local soil types, regional climates, and shifting political threats. In the absence of formal education or written plans, Peasants across distant regions reached similar solutions, not because they copied each other, but because they observed, remembered, and experimented. Trial by necessity became tradition by practice. Across the 13th and 14th centuries, long before the concept of agricultural science existed, rural communities already understood how to store rye without sprouting, how to protect root vegetables from freezing, how to mask the scent of meat from predators, animal or human, the use of ash to reduce humidity, the layering of herbs to deter insects, the shaping of chamber ceilings to resist collapse. These weren't lucky guesses. They were hard-won techniques passed down through hands, through seasons, through survival. In modern discourse, the term primitive often implies backwardness, but in historical reality, it misses the point. What these peasants achieved wasn't limited by lack of knowledge. It was driven by it. Without access to masonry, carpentry, or metallurgy, they adapted to the only medium fully within their control, earth, and they shaped it with precision. Archaeological finds continue to challenge assumptions. Grain residues, discovered in pits beneath village ruins in Denmark, show careful layering with insulating material. Storage shafts uncovered in rural Slovakia include air channels and drainage systems. These were not improvised shelters. They were permanent systems, planned, maintained, and defended. The resilience of these communities wasn't passive. It was built, quite literally, underground. In every collapsed chamber and every burned granary lies evidence, not of failure, but of effort. The effort to protect, to anticipate, to endure, in a landscape where survival wasn't guaranteed by title or wealth. People built their safety below the reach of power, not through protest, not through rebellion, but through design, through choices made in silence, through knowledge passed in darkness, through structures carved in soil. It was not charity that kept them alive. It was the memory of famine, the weight of tax, the cold logic of necessity. And it was brilliant and recognized, unsung, but never accidental.